All right, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about in our video bonding and chemical bonding specifically related to AP biology and what you need to know for AP biology. So to get us started, let's do a bit of a practice problem. Sodium has a valence number of 7. So using that information, figure out how many bonds can sodium theoretically make. This is going to be based on the number of valence electrons that you can figure out from the valence number. And then draw the outer electron orbital of sodium. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure it out. Here's your answer. If you notice, a valence number of 7 means that the outermost orbital of sodium only has 1 electron in it. So if we think about this 1 electron that sodium is going to have is going to mean something for its available bonding. Now, if we compare this, for example, to some of the other atoms that we've looked at, so for example, phosphorus or oxygen, it has significantly fewer electrons in its outermost orbital. And that's going to mean something for its ability to bond to other atoms. When we're thinking about biological molecules, these molecules are going to be made in order of trying to fill their octet rule. Now, in order to do this, they will do one of the following things. They will either interact with each other's electrons, and this is not considered a bond. This is considered an intermolecular force. It will share, these two atoms will share electrons, in which one atom says, hey, I have a little bit of extra electrons, and the other atom says, hey, I don't have enough electrons. Why don't we come together in the middle? You could also have the case where one atom says, hey, I need electrons so desperately that I am going to steal them from another atom that doesn't have as much strength when it comes to electrons. We call this force electronegativity, right? We're going to come back to ionic bonds in a second, but the attractive force of of atoms to each other is called electronegativity. So if you are thinking about what type of bond an atom will make, it's based on its electronegativity. It's a measure of how hard that atom will fight to fulfill its octet rule, right? If an atom has more valence electrons, that makes it more electronegative. So if we're looking at the periodic table, these red elements up here are extremely electronegative, everything besides the noble gases, because the noble gases, they have all 8 electrons. They are good to go. They don't need any more electrons, right? Let me get rid of my face here so you can read the whole screen. But if we go to the other side of the periodic table where we're looking at lithium and sodium and potassium, those atoms don't have as many electrons. They only have 1 electron in their outermost orbital. So they are going to be much less likely to steal electrons from other atoms. So what does it look like when an atom steals an electron? So let's go back to ionic bonds. This is sodium chloride. So sodium normally has 1 electron in its outermost orbital, and chlorine has 7 electrons in its outermost orbital. So when these two atoms, these two elements interact, what's going to happen is chlorine is going to steal the it's going to steal the electron from sodium. And that's going to give these two elements a charge. And if we were to draw the charges on these molecules, sodium would end up with a positive charge because it lost an electron. And remember, electrons are negatively charged. And chlorine would end up with a negative charge because it gained the negative charge of the electron, right? So when an ionic bond is formed, it's going to create these things called ions, which are charged charged atoms that are the result of losing or gaining an electron. Okay, that's an ionic bond. Now, In order to generalize for AP Bio, you don't need to know all of the periodic table. For a chemistry class and an AP chemistry class, you do need to know more about the periodic table. But for us, we are really interested in the essential elements. So that's going to be hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. We're also going to be interested in chlorine, sulfur, phosphorus, sodium, and potassium, as well as calcium. So those are going to be the main elements that we are interested in. So if you can, based on the periodic table that I just showed you, try to categorize the following atoms. Where do you think they would fall? Do you think they would be not highly electronegative, mildly electronegative, and highly electronegative? Now, again, these are generalizations that we can use for AP Bio. Nitrogen and oxygen are going to be considered our highly electronegative atoms. Hydrogen, phosphorus, and carbon are going to be mildly electronegative, and then sodium, potassium, and calcium are going to be not highly electronegative. Again, these are going to be specifically used for our purposes in AP Biology, right? You're going to need more specifics for other classes. Now, what happens if two atoms are not going to steal an electron, but they're going to share it? So, for example, between two hydrogen atoms. Hydrogen in the atmosphere, or hydrogen organically, comes in the form of two hydrogens stuck together. And this works out great for both of them because they can share their two electrons and fulfill their octet rule by sharing those two electrons. This type of bond, this covalent bond, occurs between two atoms of similar electronegativity. And this is where there's a relatively equal pull on the electrons. Now, within covalent bonds, there are two types of covalent bonds. You can have a nonpolar covalent bond where the electrons are equally shared. This is typically between two atoms that are either the same atom, the same element, hydrogen and hydrogen, carbon and carbon, or they are very, very similar in terms of electronegativity. They don't have a large difference in electronegativity. But in the case where there is a big difference in electronegativities, for example, with water, oxygen is going to have a much stronger pull on the electrons, and hydrogen is going to have a very weak pull on the electrons compared to oxygen. Again, remember, this is about relativity. This is relative to each other. This is oxygen relative to hydrogen. So because oxygen has a relatively or a comparatively stronger electronegativity to hydrogen, it's going to yank on those electrons and it's not going to steal them entirely. This is still a covalent bond, but it's going to be greedy with those electrons. And so in the same way as we looked at the ionic bond with the electrons sort of floating around in the orbitals outside of them, in the covalent bond, the polar covalent bond, oxygen sort of monopolizes the electrons of hydrogen and sort of steals their time, right? So if they're all kind of hanging out with each other, they're friends, oxygen and hydrogens are friends here. Hydrogen doesn't get to hang out with its electrons very often because oxygen is spending all of its time with hydrogen's electrons, right? And this is going to create what we call a dipole. A dipole is a slightly charged region of a molecule due to unequal charge. Now, this unequal charge is often the result of lone pairs. Lone pairs are two sets of electrons, or excuse me, sets of two electrons that are not in a bond. So if we notice in water, there are two lone pairs up here, and this is going to cause that negative charge. Essentially, these highly electronegative, these negatively charged electrons, not electronegative, but negatively charged electrons, they are going to form intermolecular bonds with other atoms or molecules. So let's take a look at how this can potentially look. Let's look at an example. Hydrogen bonds are an example of lone pair interactions. So in this diagram, you can't see the lone pairs, but go back to this diagram, this water molecule up here, and you can see the lone pairs attached to oxygen. So let's go back to this diagram. What happens in water with hydrogen bonds is a negative dipole on oxygen, those lone pairs, end up being attracted to the positive dipole of hydrogen, these positive charges, positive dipoles. Remember, they're not charges. Charges are different. Those are with ions. But this attraction between the negative and the positive partial charge, the attraction between the negative and the positive dipoles, causes a connection. Now, individually, those connections are very weak. Individual hydrogen bonds are really easy to break. This is why you can stick your hand into water and it separates and you can end up coming away with water all over your hand. Water hydrogen bonds are easy to break. Collectively together, they can provide immense strength. This is how things like boats are able to float on the surfaces of water. And this is also how things like, if you've ever watched a water strider walk across water, this is how it's able to do that. Hydrogen bonds essentially are repelling the surface and are going to hold tension on that surface. We're going to look at this more in class during our lab. Now, you can also have van der Waal interactions, and this is where the charged regions of a surface can interact to form very weak bonds. Again, weak bonds that in large quantities can provide strong forces. An example of this is a gecko. So if you look at a gecko's foot, it's going to have this really interesting sort of flapped surface area, and this flap is going to stick to whatever surface they're stuck to. And because of the charges attached to their feet and to the surface, these attractive forces are going to allow the gecko to stick to whatever surface it's trying to climb to. And this force is only possible because of an accumulation of forces, accumulation of interactions. We're not going to look at van der Waals interactions too much in AP Bio, but you should be aware of them. So just to kind of summarize in terms of the strength of different types of bonds, right? Ionic bonds are going to be the strongest types of bonds because they create these charges, and those are going to create this sort of permanence to the bond between the two atoms. Polar covalent bonds are going to be the next strongest, and after that is non-polar covalent bonds, and followed by hydrogen bonds in terms of the weakest individual bonds. Together, very strong forces, but the bonds themselves individually are very weak. Now, what does this mean for AP Bio? In AP Bio, we are interested in how hydrogen bonds are going to be constantly broken and remade. So we're going to start with this information when we come together in class. We need to be familiar with the fact that hydrogen bonds are going to be in a bunch of water molecules at any given time, and it's going to result in 3 different ion formations. And these are temporary ions that are going to result from the dipoles. Again, we're going to go over this more in class later. Essentially, what happens is that a hydroxide ion with a partial negative charge and a hydronium ion are going to be created that result in these protons, these loose positive charges, being transferred between hydrogen bonds and being transferred between water molecules. So in class, or you can do this right now, I encourage you to pause the video and try to explain why is a hydroxide ion negatively charged versus a hydronium ion being positively charged. Think about that question And then we are going to use that to talk about hydrogen bonds when we come back together, because this equation essentially summarizes the polarity and the breaking of water into two separate structures. So this is going to be hydroxide and hydrogen ions that are going to be really important when we talk about acids and bases. So this is just sort of an introduction, a quick run through summary of some of the chemistry that you should know for AP Bio. This is not intended to be an introduction to chemistry. This is intended to be a review of chemistry for AP Bio. Hopefully that was helpful.